The sun over the New Mexico territory was a merciless, brassy coin nailed to a bleached white sky. It baked the land until the dirt cracked like old pottery in the wind. When it came, offered no relief, only a gritty mouthful of dust. It was a place that had long ago given up on the promise of rain. Into this parched landscape rode Eli Carson, a man as weathered and quiet as the terrain he traveled. He was not old, but the 30 years he had lived were etched around his eyes and in the set of his jaw. He rode a sturdy buckskin horse that moved with the same steady, unhurried pace as its rider. Eli was not looking for trouble, nor was he looking for fortune. He was looking for work, and a measure of quiet to go with it. He had had his fill of the other things. The town, if one could call it that, was little more than a single dusty street flanked by a dozen sun-warped buildings. A saloon with louvered doors stood opposite a general store, its windows clouded with a fine layer of ochre dust. A livery, a blacksmith, and a few nameless, shuttered houses completed the settlement. A sign, its paint peeling to reveal the gray wood beneath, announced the town's name in a hopeful scrawl that the landscape mocked with every sunrise: redemption. Eli did not believe in redemption, but he did believe in a day's pay for a day's work. He swung down from his horse in front of the livery, the leather of his saddle creaking in the profound silence. The work came easier than he expected. The livery owner, a man whose bones seemed to be made of dried twigs, pointed him east. "Weatherby Ranch," the man rasped, spitting a stream of tobacco juice that sizzled on the ground. "He's always in need of hands. Can't seem to keep 'em." The man's tone suggested this was a failing of the ranch, not the men. Eli nodded his thanks, bought a small sack of oats for his horse, and rode out as the sun began its slow, blistering descent. The Weatherby Ranch sprawled over a valley that might have been beautiful once, before the drought had bled the green from the grass, leaving only brittle, yellowed stalks. The main house was a 2-story affair, larger than any Eli had seen in months, but like the sign in town, it wore an air of neglect. Paint curled away from the siding, and a shutter on an upper window hung from a single hinge, a tired, unblinking eye. A long, low stable and several smaller outbuildings stood nearby, connected by a network of corrals and fences, some of which listed at weary angles. A man emerged from the stable as Eli approached. He was thick-set, with a florid face and eyes that seemed permanently narrowed against the sun. This was Mr. Weatherby. His handshake was limp, his grip surprisingly weak for a man who ran a spread this size. He looked Eli up and down, a flicker of something, disdain, or maybe just exhaustion, in his gaze. "You know horses?" Weatherby asked. His voice was gravelly, roughened by whiskey and dust. "Yes, sir," Eli replied. "Cattle, too. I can mend a fence and I can handle a rope. We're mostly running horses these days. The cattle are thin." Weatherby gestured vaguely toward the parched fields. "Pay is $20 a month and keep. Bunkhouse is over there. Supper's at sundown." He did not ask for Eli's name, nor did he offer his own, but everyone in this territory knew of the Weatherby Ranch. It had once been a titan, a place of prominence and wealth, run by a man who commanded respect. But that was before his wife had died. The stories varied. Some said it was a sickness that took her quick. Others whispered of a fall from a horse. Whatever the truth, her passing had marked the beginning of the ranch's long, slow decline. Mr. Weatherby, it was said, had started to drink, and the life had begun to seep out of the land and the man in equal measure. Eli found the bunkhouse and claimed an empty cot. There were 4 other hands, men with hard faces and guarded eyes. They nodded at him when he entered, their conversation, which had been a low murmur, ceasing altogether. He felt their eyes on him as he stowed his meager belongings, a bedroll, a spare shirt, and a worn copy of Shakespeare's tragedies he had carried for years. He learned their names over a supper of beans and hard biscuits. Jed, a wiry man with a nervous twitch. Silas, old and stooped, who seemed to communicate only in grunts, and two younger men, brothers named Hank and Charlie, who moved and spoke with a bravado that felt brittle and rehearsed. In the days that followed, Eli settled into the rhythm of the ranch. The work was hard, the sun relentless, but it was honest labor. He gentled a high-strung mare, reshod 2 draft horses, and spent hours repairing a section of fence on the northern pasture. Yet, beneath the surface of the daily chores, an unspoken tension hummed. The men worked with a strange kind of caution. Their voices were always low, their laughter never loud. They performed their duties with a quiet efficiency, but their eyes often strayed toward the main house, a place they seemed to view with a mixture of fear and resentment. Eli noticed that a whole section of the property was treated as if it did not exist. The garden behind the house, though overgrown with weeds, was never entered. The back porch was never used, and no one, for any reason, went near the second floor of the main house. Once, when Hank had been sent to the kitchen to fetch a bucket of water, he had returned pale and tight-lipped. Charlie had asked him what was wrong. "Just the house," Hank had mumbled, shaking his head. "It ain't right in there." The men's talk was a careful dance around a hollow center. They spoke of the drought, of the price of feed, of a wolf that had been seen near the creek bed, but they never spoke of Mrs. Weatherby's death, and they never, ever spoke of a stepdaughter. Eli had heard a whisper in town, a passing remark about Weatherby having a daughter from his late wife's first marriage, but out here, her existence was a ghost, a void that everyone meticulously ignored. It was as if the very air on the ranch was heavy with secrets, and to breathe too deeply was to risk choking on them. About a week into his tenure, the wind shifted. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, turned a sickly yellow-brown. A dust storm was rolling in from the west, a roiling wall of earth and grit that swallowed the horizon. The men worked frantically to secure the livestock, their shouts snatched away by the rising gale. The air grew thick and tasted of soil. Visibility dropped to a few feet. Eli, his bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth, led the last of the horses into the long, dark stable. The wind shrieked outside, a high, mournful sound like a woman wailing. Dust found its way through every crack in the walls, coating everything in a fine, gritty film. The horses stamped restlessly in their stalls, their eyes wide and white in the flickering lantern light. Eli moved among them, his voice a low, calming murmur, his hands running over their backs. He was checking the latches on the stall doors when he heard it. At first, he thought it was the wind, another trick of the storm, but it was different. It was a sound of pure, human misery, the raw, ragged sound of someone sobbing. It was quiet, nearly lost in the howl of the gale, but it was there, coming from the far end of the stable, from the last unused stall that was filled with old hay and broken tack. Eli picked up his lantern, its light cutting a shaky, golden path through the dusty gloom. He walked slowly, his boots scuffing softly on the dirt floor. The sobbing grew clearer now, punctuated by desperate, hitched breaths. He reached the final stall. The wooden door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, and there she was. Curled in a pile of old, dusty hay was a girl. She could not have been more than 18. She was barefoot, her feet smudged with dirt. A simple, thin cotton shift, once white but now gray with dust, was all she wore. Her hair, the color of dark honey, was a tangled mess around her shoulders. She was pale, so pale her skin seemed almost translucent in the lantern light, and she was trembling, her whole body shaking with a fear that went deeper than the storm. Her head was buried in her arms, her thin shoulders heaving with each sob. Eli stood frozen in the doorway, the lantern held aloft. He felt as if he had stumbled upon a wounded animal, a creature so broken and terrified that his very presence was a threat. He made no sound, but she must have sensed him, because her head shot up. Her eyes were wide, the color of a summer sky just before a storm, and they were filled with a raw, primal fear. Her face was smudged with dirt and tears, her lips parted in a silent gasp. She scrambled backward, trying to press herself into the corner of the stall, into the very wood itself, as if she could will herself to disappear. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile, broken thing. "Please, do not tell him you saw me. Please." Eli's heart, a steady and reliable muscle, gave a hard, painful lurch. He had seen fear before. He had seen it in the eyes of men facing a drawn gun, in the eyes of a horse trapped in a fire. But he had never seen fear like this. This was an old fear, a fear that had been lived in, breathed in, for a very long time. He lowered the lantern, trying to make himself seem smaller, less of a threat. He kept his voice low and even. "I won't tell anyone," he said. The words felt inadequate, flimsy against the weight of her terror. "I'm just checking on the horses." She watched him, her breath still coming in shallow, ragged bursts. She did not seem to believe him, but some of the frantic energy drained out of her, replaced by a weary, hollow-eyed resignation. She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them, making herself as small as possible. She was a ghost in the lantern light, a secret hidden in the heart of the storm, unsettled in a way he could not name. Eli backed away slowly, pulling the stall door almost closed, leaving just a sliver of light for her. He did not know who he was, but he could guess. He finished his rounds in a daze. The girl's terrified eyes burned into his memory. The storm raged all night, but for Eli, the real tempest was the one that had just begun inside the quiet walls of his own mind. The next morning, the dust had settled, leaving a fresh brown coat on a thirsty world. The air was still and heavy. At breakfast, Eli said nothing. He ate his beans, drank his coffee, and listened to the men talk about the storm. He worked all day as if nothing had happened, his face a calm, unreadable mask, but his mind was a whirlwind. Who was she? Why was she hiding in a stable? And what had been done to her to put that look in her eyes? He began to ask questions, but he was careful. He did not ask directly. He listened. He watched. He waited for the moments when the other men's guards were down. He learned more from their silences than from their words. "Boss has been in a foul mood since the storm," Hank commented one afternoon as he and Eli were mending a harness. "He's always in a foul mood," Charlie grumbled from across the barn. Eli kept his head down, working a piece of leather with an awl. "He live in that big house by himself?" he asked, his tone casual. Hank and Charlie exchanged a quick, uneasy glance. "Mostly," Hank said, his voice dropping. He leaned closer. "He has a stepdaughter, from his wife." "I haven't seen her around," Eli said, feigning disinterest. "You won't," Charlie said gruffly. "She's not right in the head. Keeps to herself. The boss keeps her hidden away, for her own good." "Her own good," Hank repeated, but there was no conviction in his voice. It sounded like a line he had been told to say, a line he had repeated so many times it had lost all meaning. Later, Eli cornered Silas, the old, quiet hand, as he was brushing down a gelding. "That girl," Eli began softly. "Mr. Weatherby's stepdaughter. What is her name?" Silas stopped brushing and stared at the horse's flank, his shoulders hunched. For a long moment, Eli thought he would not answer. Then, without looking at him, the old man mumbled. "Clara Bell." He said the name as if it were a secret, something dangerous to speak aloud. He spat on the ground and then resumed his brushing with a renewed, almost frantic energy, a clear signal that the conversation was over. Clara Bell. The name was a strange counterpoint to the image of the terrified girl in the hay. It was a name that suggested sunshine and church bells, not shadows and fear. Eli could not stop thinking about her. He saw her everywhere, in the skittishness of a new foal, in the fragile beauty of a wildflower pushing its way through the cracked earth, in the haunting blue of the twilight sky. He saw her pale, trembling form and her wide, frightened eyes. He heard her whispered plea. The men's words echoed in his mind. Not right in the head. For her own good, he did not believe them. He had not seen madness in her eyes. He had seen sorrow, a sorrow so deep it felt like a sickness of the soul. He felt a slow, cold anger begin to build within him, a quiet, steady rage against the unknown injustice of her life. He started watching the stable more closely, his work often taking him in that direction. For 3 days, he saw nothing. The far stall remained empty, a silent, dusty space that held the ghost of her memory. He began to wonder if he had imagined it, if the storm and the shadows had played a trick on his mind. Then, on the 4th day, as dusk was settling over the valley and the sky was streaked with purple and orange, he saw her. He was leading a horse from the corral to the stable when he caught a flicker of movement near the far end. He tied the horse in its stall and walked casually toward the back, his heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. She was there, in the same stall, standing in the shadows. She was not crying this time. She was just standing, her hands clasped in front of her, her head bowed. She looked up as he approached, and for a second, the fear returned to her eyes. She tensed, ready to flee. Eli stopped a few feet from the doorway. He held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace. He did not speak. She watched him for a long moment, her gaze searching his face. Then, in a voice that was barely a whisper, she said, "You did not tell." "I said I would not," he replied, his voice soft. A silence stretched between them, thick with all the things they could not say. He saw that she was painfully thin, her cheekbones sharp angles in her pale face. There were faint, bluish shadows under her eyes, like bruises. "Are you hungry?" he asked, the question surprising him as much as it did her. She flinched slightly at the directness of it, but then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Her eyes darted around, as if expecting someone to appear from the shadows. "Wait here," he said. He walked back to the bunkhouse, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The other men were washing up for supper. No one paid him any mind. He went to his saddlebag and took out a piece of jerky and an apple he had been saving. He wrapped them in a clean bandana and walked back to the stable. She was still there, a statue carved from moonlight and fear. He held out the small bundle. She hesitated, her eyes fixed on his hand. Then, slowly, like a fawn approaching a stranger, she stepped forward and took it from him. Her fingers brushed against his, and her skin was as cold as stone. She retreated back into the shadows of her stall and sank down into the hay. She unwrapped the bandana with trembling fingers. She ate the jerky first, tearing at it with a quiet desperation that twisted something in Eli's gut. Then she ate the apple, her small, white teeth sinking into the red skin. She ate in complete silence, her eyes never leaving his face, watching him as if he were a puzzle she could not solve. Eli leaned against the wooden frame of the stall, his arms crossed over his chest. He did not speak. He just watched her eat. He gave her the gift of his silence, of his stillness. The world outside the stable faded away. There was only the dusty, golden light of the fading day, the sweet, earthy scent of hay, and the quiet sound of a hungry girl eating an apple. A distant rumble of thunder rolled across the plains, the promise of a storm that had not yet broken. When she was finished, she carefully folded the bandana and held it out to him. He shook his head. "Keep it." She clutched the small square of cloth to her chest. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them. It was not a word, not a gesture, but a silent acknowledgement. A fragile, hesitant connection was forged there in the quiet of the stable. A bond built on a shared secret and a simple act of kindness. It was a wordless thing, but it was real. as real as the scent of hay in the air and the low, rumbling thunder of the distant storms that were gathering on the edge of their world. Their silent conversation began the next evening. When Eli went to the stable for his final check, he carried with him a small, folded wool blanket he had purchased in a town 2 states away. It was clean and soft, a stark contrast to the dusty, rough-spun burlap bags in the far stall. He placed it neatly in the corner, on top of a pile of fresh, sweet-smelling hay he had laid down earlier that day. He did not see her, but he felt her presence in the shadows, a quiet, watchful energy. He said nothing, and left. The following day, the blanket was gone. In its place, tucked into a crevice between 2 wooden slats, was a small, faded blue ribbon, tied into a simple bow. It was worn, the silk frayed at the edges, but it was clean. Eli carefully untucked it, the small piece of fabric feeling impossibly delicate in his calloused hand. He slipped it into his shirt pocket, where it rested against his chest, a secret token. Their unspoken ritual continued. One day, he left a shiny red apple, and the next he found a smooth, gray river stone in its place. He left a piece of honeycomb, wrapped in wax paper, its sweetness a forbidden luxury, and found a single, perfectly formed hawk feather waiting for him. These small, simple exchanges became the center of his world, a silent language of trust being built in the dusty shadows of the stable. One evening, feeling a strange impulse, he tore a small, blank page from the back of his Shakespeare volume. He did not write a letter. He did not know the words. Instead, he simply drew a crude, childish picture of a bird in flight. The next day, he found she had drawn a flower underneath it, its petals shyly unfurled. With each passing day, his awareness of the ranch's dark undercurrents grew sharper. He pieced together the history of the Weatherby family from the careless whispers of the other hands and the bitter, unguarded ramblings of the livery owner in town. Clara's mother, Eleanor, had been a woman from a good family back east, a widow with a young daughter. She had married Weatherby for security, bringing her considerable inheritance with her. For a few years, the ranch had flourished. Eleanor was, by all accounts, a kind and gentle woman who doted on her daughter. Then, 5 years ago, she had died. The official story was an illness, a fever that came on fast and took her in the night. But Silas, the old hand, once let slip a different version after a rare dram of whiskey. An argument, he'd mumbled into his cup, his eyes fixed on the bunkhouse floor. Heard him yelling. The next morning, she was gone. He said she fell down the stairs. Later, he told the doctor it was a fever. The story changes depending on who's asking. After her death, Weatherby had inherited everything: the ranch, the money, and the quiet, grieving child named Clara Bell. From that day on, the girl had begun to disappear. First, she was withdrawn from the small-town school. Then she was no longer seen in the garden. Soon, she was not seen at all. The ranch began its slow decay, mirroring the decay in the man who owned it. Eli started to see the signs of it everywhere. He saw the way the house was kept. The windows on the second floor always shuttered, as if sealing something away from the light. He saw the way Weatherby drank, starting in the afternoon and continuing late into the night, his voice growing louder and fouler with each glass. He began to suspect things he did not want to put a name to, a quiet and persistent cruelty that was far worse than the town's simple-minded gossip. The girl was not right in the head. She was terrified. She was a prisoner in her own home, and the men who worked here were either too scared or too callous to do anything about it. Their silence was a form of complicity, a wall as real as the fences that enclosed the ranch. One evening, he found her sitting on the folded wool blanket, the scrap of paper with their drawings held carefully in her hands. The fading light from the stable door cast long shadows, and she looked small and fragile, a part of the twilight itself. He sat on an overturned bucket a few feet away, giving her space. For a long time, they sat in silence, The only sounds the soft sighing of the horses and the distant call of a coyote. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, unused, like a dusty instrument being played for the first time in years. "You should not be kind to me." Eli turned his head to look at her. Her face was in shadow, but he could see the earnestness in her posture, the tension in her small frame. "Why not?" he asked, his own voice a low rumble. "People who are kind to me," she said, her words careful and measured, as if she were reciting a lesson learned through pain. "They get punished. He makes them leave, or he hurts them." The quiet rage that had been simmering inside Eli for weeks solidified into a cold, hard knot in his stomach. He had seen it. A young stable boy, no older than 15, had been fired a week ago for a minor infraction. Weatherby had claimed the boy was lazy, but Eli had seen him offer Clara a wildflower he had picked by the creek. The next day, the boy was gone, his eyes red-rimmed, a dark bruise blooming on his cheek. At the time, Eli had thought it was just Weatherby's drunken temper. Now, he understood. It was a warning. "I can take care of myself," Eli said, the words feeling like a vow. She shook her head, a small, sad movement in the gloom. "No one can," she whispered. "Not here." He knew she was right. In a way, the West was a hard country, and it had its own brutal code. A man's home was his castle, his family, his property. A drifter, a hired hand, had no standing to interfere. To pick a fight with a landowner like Weatherby was not just foolish, it was suicidal. Eli was a capable man, and he was not afraid of a fight. But he knew the difference between courage and recklessness. He had to be careful, for her sake. He could not protect her if he was run off the ranch or lying dead in a ditch. So he held his anger in check, letting it burn low and steady inside him, a hidden flame that fueled his watchfulness. He began to observe Mr. Weatherby with a new, focused intensity. He saw the man for what he was, a petty tyrant ruling a crumbling kingdom of dust and fear. He watched how Weatherby's eyes would follow Clara whenever she risked stepping out of the house for a moment, a predatory gleam in their depths. Once, he saw her walking near the edge of the overgrown garden, her head tilted up toward the sky. Weatherby had come out onto the porch, his face a mask of thunder. He had not said a word, but he had glared at her, a look of such pure venom and possession that Clara had visibly flinched, scurrying back into the shadows of the house like a mouse cornered by a hawk. A trip into redemption for supplies confirmed Eli's fears about the world beyond the ranch gates. Prejudice, he learned, was a weed that grew deep and tangled in this arid soil. He sat in the corner of the saloon, nursing a single beer, and listened. The talk eventually turned to the Weatherby place. "A shame what's become of that ranch," one man said, wiping foam from his mustache. "Was the finest spread in the territory when Eleanor was alive." "It's the girl," another man chimed in, his voice thick with authority. "She's a curse on the place. Always was a strange child. Touched, keeps to herself, stares at nothing. Weatherby does his best, keeping her protected. But a man can only do so much." "I heard she's spoiled rotten," a woman from the general store added, her voice sharp and gossipy. "Won't speak to anyone. Thinks she's too good for the likes of us, just because her mother came from the East. He keeps her away for her own good. A girl like that, simple-minded and pretty, she'd be nothing but trouble out in the world." Eli listened, his hand tightening around his glass. They spoke of her as if she were an object, a problem to be managed. They preferred the comfort of a simple, cruel rumor over the difficult, inconvenient truth. It was easier to believe that Clara was strange, that Weatherby was a long-suffering guardian, than to confront the ugly possibility that a prominent man in their community was a monster. They had judged her without ever knowing her, condemned her without ever hearing her voice. Eli realized with a chilling certainty that there would be no help for Clara in this town. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone, except for him. The fragile peace of their stable meetings was shattered a few nights later. Another storm was brewing, the air thick and electric with unspoken violence. Eli had finished his work and was walking toward the stable when he heard it again, the sound that had first led him to her, the sound of weeping. But this time, it was different. It was not the sound of deep, resigned sorrow. It was the sound of fresh, sharp pain. He quickened his pace, his heart hammering against his ribs. He found her in the far stall, huddled in the hay, shaking uncontrollably. The wool blanket was wrapped tightly around her shoulders, but it could not stop the tremors that racked her body. "Clara," he said softly, kneeling in the dirt beside her. She looked up, and in the dim light of the lantern he had set down. He saw the glint of tears on her cheeks and something else, blood. A thin, dark line of it trickled from her wrist, staining the sleeve of her simple dress. He reached for her hand gently. "What happened?" She tried to pull away, a reflexive, frightened movement. "It is nothing." "Let me see," he insisted, his voice firm but gentle. He took her arm, and she relented, her body going limp with exhaustion. He pushed back the sleeve. There was a long, ugly gash on her forearm, shallow but bleeding freely. It was not a clean cut. The edges were ragged, torn. Below it, her wrist was red and raw, bruised in the shape of a man's fingers. The cold rage inside Eli burned hot for a moment, and he had to clench his jaw to keep it from spilling out. He took a deep, steadying breath. "How did this happen, Clara?" She would not meet his eyes. She stared at a point on the stable wall, her voice a near inaudible whisper. "The wall," she said. "By the garden. I wanted to see the road. I wanted to see if the world was still there." Her voice broke on a sob. "I was climbing, and he caught me. He pulled me down." The image flooded Eli's mind. This small, desperate girl, trying to climb a stone wall for a glimpse of freedom, and Weatherby's brutal hand yanking her back into the darkness. He felt a wave of nausea. He took the clean bandana from his pocket and pressed it gently against the cut. She hissed in pain, but did not pull away. "I have to clean this," he said. He went to the water pump, his movements swift and sure. He returned with a bucket of clean water and a small piece of soap he took from his own supplies. He knelt before her again and carefully, tenderly, washed the blood and grime from her arm. She watched him, her eyes wide and luminous with unshed tears, her breath catching in her throat with every gentle touch. When it was clean, he tore a strip from the bottom of his own shirt and wrapped it firmly around her forearm, fashioning a neat, secure bandage. He finished his work, but he did not move away. She was still shaking, though more gently now. The storm outside was breaking, rain beginning to lash against the roof of the stable, the wind moaning through the eaves. It was a wild, violent night, but inside their small pocket of the world, there was a profound quiet. She looked at him, her gaze filled with a weary, heartbreaking gratitude. "You will be punished for this," she whispered. "Let him try," Eli said, and the words were quiet, but they held the weight of steel. He did not leave. He could not. The thought of her being alone in the dark, with her pain and her fear, was unbearable. He sat down in the hay beside her, his back against the rough wood of the stall. He did not touch her, not at first. He just sat there, a silent, solid presence in the storm. After a long while, her trembling subsided, replaced by a deep, shuddering exhaustion. Her head drooped, and her eyes began to close. Hesitantly, he reached out and put his arm around her shoulders, pulling her gently against his side. She stiffened for a moment, a lifetime of fear making her recoil from human touch. But then, with a small, sighing breath, she relaxed into him, her head coming to rest on his shoulder. She was so light, she felt like a bird. He could feel the fragile beating of her heart against his ribs. The storm raged. The rain fell in sheets. The thunder cracked overhead, shaking the very foundations of the stable. But Eli did not move. He sat there in the dark, the scent of hay and rain and Clara's hair filling his senses. He started to hum, a low, tuneless melody from his childhood, a simple song his own mother used to sing to ward off the dark. He felt her breathing deepen, evening out into the slow, steady rhythm of sleep. He held her through the long, dark hours of the night. He watched the lantern burn low, casting flickering shadows on the walls. He listened to the storm slowly spend its fury, the rain softening to a gentle patter. He thought of the life she must have lived, a life of silence and shadows and fear, and his heart ached with a tenderness so fierce it felt like a wound. He was a simple man. He had never asked for much from the world, but in the deep, profound quiet of that stable, holding this broken, sleeping girl in his arms, he knew he had found something he was not willing to lose. The first hint of dawn came as a pale, gray light seeping through the cracks in the stable walls. The rain had stopped. The world was washed clean, quiet and still. Clara stirred in his arms, but did not wake. Eli watched the light grow, turning from gray to pink, from pink to a soft, hopeful gold. The sun was rising. A new day was beginning. He stayed until the first rays of sunlight slanted through the open stable door, falling across the hay-strewn floor. He looked down at Clara's face, peaceful in sleep. The tear tracks on her cheeks dried, the lines of fear and pain momentarily erased, and in that moment, with the light of the new day on her face, he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that he was no longer just passing through. He had picked his fight. He would not leave till sunrise. He had promised himself through the long night, and now that the sun was here, he knew, with every fiber of his being, that he would never leave her behind. The quiet sanctuary Eli had built for Clara in the shadows of the stable could not remain hidden forever. Secrets, like water in a drought-stricken land, have a way of being found out. The other hands began to notice the small changes. They saw the new alertness in Eli's eyes, the way he often found reasons to be near the stables long after the horses were settled. Jed, the wiry one, noticed the clean hay in the far stall. Hank and Charlie, the young brothers, whispered to each other about the faint tracks they sometimes saw in the dust leading to and from the back of the stable. Tracks too small to be a man's. The bunkhouse, once a place of gruff but easy camaraderie, grew tense. Conversations would halt when Eli entered. Men would watch him from the corners of their eyes as he read his book by the evening lamplight. A silent judgment hanging in the smoky air. They did not know the truth, but they sensed a secret, and in a place ruled by a man as volatile as Weatherby, any secret was a danger. They saw Eli as a man stepping over a line they all knew was there, a line drawn around the house and the ghost who lived inside it. Their suspicion was a form of self-preservation. They did not want to be caught in the blast when Eli's secret finally exploded. The explosion came on a blistering hot afternoon. The air was still and thick, the sun a white fire in the sky. Hank, the younger of the two brothers, had been sent to the well near the main house for a bucket of cool water. As he was returning, Clara had appeared for a fleeting moment in the doorway of the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. She had looked at Hank, her eyes wide with a desperate, silent thirst, acting on a simple, human impulse. Hank had hesitated, shifting the bucket as if to offer her a drink. It was all Weatherby needed to see. He burst from the front door of the house like a bull, his face purple with rage and whiskey. He snatched the bucket from Hank's hand, throwing it to the ground where the precious water vanished instantly into the dust. "What did I tell you about looking at her?" Weatherby roared, his voice cracking. "What did I tell you about speaking to her?" "I did not say nothing. Mr. Weatherby, I swear," Hank stammered, stumbling backward, his face ashen with terror. Weatherby was beyond reason. He grabbed the front of Hank's shirt, his knuckles white, and drew back his fist. The other men, who had been working in the nearby corral, froze. They looked at the ground, at the sky, anywhere but at the scene unfolding before them. This was Weatherby's law, and they were powerless subjects. But Eli did not look away. He had been replacing a rotted post not 20 feet away, and he moved before he had even formed a conscious thought. He did not run. He did not shout. He walked, his pace steady and deliberate, and placed himself between Weatherby and the terrified boy. He did not touch Weatherby, but his presence was a solid, unmovable wall. The horse in the end stall cast a shoe. "Sir," Eli said, his voice calm and even, cutting through Weatherby's rage, "I will need help at the forge to hold him steady. He is a big one." Weatherby turned his furious gaze on Eli, his eyes bloodshot and narrowed to slits. "You stay out of this, Carson. This is my business." "The horse is your business, too," Eli replied, his tone still maddeningly level. "A 1,000-pound animal with a loose shoe is liable to lame himself. That would be a costly loss." He held Weatherby's gaze, and for a long, tense moment, the two men were locked in a silent battle of wills. Weatherby's rage was a hot, sputtering fire. Eli's opposition was like cold, hard iron. In his eyes, Weatherby saw something he had not expected, a complete lack of fear. He saw a man who had weighed the consequences and was not intimidated. Slowly, grudgingly, the fury in Weatherby's face gave way to a sullen resentment. He released Hank's shirt with a violent shove that sent the boy stumbling into the dust. "Fine," Weatherby snarled at Eli. "Deal with the damn horse." He turned and stalked back toward the house, slamming the door behind him with a force that seemed to shake the very air. Hank scrambled to his feet, trembling, and mumbled his thanks to Eli before hurrying away. Eli watched the house, his expression unreadable, his hand resting on the handle of the hammer at his belt. He had intervened, but he knew he had not won. He had only postponed a debt, and Weatherby was not a man who forgave his debtors. That night, in the stable, Clara was waiting for him. The incident had emboldened her. The wall of silence she had lived behind for years was beginning to crumble. "He hurt that boy because of me," she said, her voice filled with a guilt that was not hers to bear. "He hurt that boy because he is a cruel man," Eli corrected her gently. "It has nothing to do with you. Clara." She began to talk then, the words spilling out in a quiet, halting rush, as if a dam had finally broken. She told him about her mother, about her laughter and the songs she used to sing. She described her mother's death, not as a peaceful passing from a fever, but as a night of shouting that ended with a terrible, final silence. She remembered waking the next morning to find her world irrevocably broken. She spoke of the years that followed, a long, gray twilight of isolation. She told him how, one by one, the things that connected her to the world were taken away. First her books, then her walks in the garden, then even the view from her window, when he had nailed shutters over it. He had told her the world was a wicked place, that men would hurt her, that she was strange and unlovable, and that he was keeping her safe. She had almost come to believe him. "I have never been to a church," she confessed, her eyes wide with the scope of her own ignorance. "I have never seen a town with more than one street. I have never seen a train. My mother used to read to me every night. After she died, he burned her books. All of them. The one you have. It is the first book I have held in 5 years." Eli's heart ached for the vast, empty spaces in her life, for the simple, ordinary joys that had been stolen from her. Their bond, forged in silence, was now being tempered by words. It deepened with every shared secret, with every quiet confession in the fading light of the stable. One evening, as he was telling her a story about seeing the ocean when he was a boy, she reached out and hesitantly, her fingers trembling, touched the back of his hand. It was a touch as light as a feather, but it sent a shock through him, a jolt of warmth and connection that was more powerful than any word. He began to bring the world to her in small, careful pieces. He taught her how to whistle, a simple, clear note that he used to calm horses. She practiced for days, her first attempts nothing more than airy hisses. Then one evening, she managed it. A single, pure, warbling note that echoed in the quiet of the stable. A look of pure, unadulterated astonishment crossed her face. And then it happened. She laughed. It was not a loud sound. It was soft and a little rusty, like a bell that had not been rung in years, but it was a laugh, and it was the most beautiful sound Eli had ever heard. He looked at her, at the way her eyes crinkled at the corners, at the genuine joy that lit her face, and he felt his own heart crack open. The quiet rage he carried inside him was now intertwined with a fierce, protective tenderness that was terrifying in its intensity. "I will not let him hurt you again. Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. "I swear it." The laughter faded from her face, replaced by the old, familiar sadness. She looked down at her hands, twisting a piece of hay between her fingers. "It is not just him," she said quietly. "It is everyone. They will not let me love anyone." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "He told me I am cursed. He said my mother died because of me. He said my strangeness drove her to an early grave. He says anyone who gets close to me will be destroyed." The poison of Weatherby's words had seeped deep into her soul. Eli knelt in front of her, taking her small, calloused hand in his. Her skin was cool, her fingers delicate. He did not say a word. He simply lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a slow, reverent kiss to her knuckles. It was not a kiss of passion, but of devotion. It was an act of silent defiance, a gesture that said, without words, that she was not cursed, that she was not untouchable, that she was worthy of gentleness and respect. She stared at him, her eyes filling with tears. She began to cry, but it was different this time. It was not the silent, shaking despair he had seen before. This was a storm of grief, a great shuddering release of years of pain and loneliness. And he was her anchor in the storm, his hand holding hers, his presence a steady, unwavering comfort. Their stolen moments of peace were numbered. A few days later, Weatherby, in a drunken stupor, stumbled into the stable late at night. He was not looking for anything in particular, just roaming his property with the restless, angry energy of a caged animal. And he saw it, a flicker of candlelight from the far stall, a place that should have been dark and empty. He lurched toward it, his boots heavy in the dirt. He threw open the door. Clara was there, sitting on the wool blanket, Eli's worn copy of Shakespeare open in her lap, her finger tracing the words as she read by the light of a single, small candle. She looked up, and her face went white with terror. Weatherby's roar of fury was inhuman. He snatched the book from her hands, his eyes wild. "What is this? Who gave you this?" He saw the unfamiliar blanket, the signs of a hidden life, and his rage turned into a possessive, jealous madness. He grabbed Clara by the arm, hauling her to her feet. "You will learn to obey me," he spat, his words slurred with whiskey. He dragged her out of the stable and toward the dark, silent house. Eli, who had been on his way for their nightly meeting, heard the roar and saw the scene from the edge of the corral. He started to run, but he was too late. He saw Weatherby drag her through the back door, and then he heard the sickening sound of a heavy bolt being thrown. An upstairs light flickered on for a moment, in a window that had always been dark, the attic, and was then extinguished. A blind, white-hot fury, unlike anything he had ever known, surged through Eli. His first instinct was to kick down the door, to tear the house apart with his bare hands. But he knew that would only get him killed and leave Clara to her fate. He forced himself to think. The law. He had to get the marshal. He saddled his horse in a frenzy, his hands shaking with rage. He was about to ride out when a hand grasped his arm. It was Silas, the old hand, his face etched with worry in the moonlight. "Do not do it, son," the old man whispered, his voice urgent. "Do not go to the law." "He has her locked in the attic," Eli bit out, his voice a low growl. "He is going to kill her." I know what he is, Silas said, his eyes filled with a weary sadness. But the marshal will not touch him. Weatherby owns half the land in this county. He has the judge in his pocket. They will call it a family matter. They will arrest you for trespassing. And then what good will you be to her? They will throw you in a cell, and he will be free to do his worst. The old man's words were the cold, hard truth, and Eli knew it. The law in this territory was a tool for the rich and powerful, not a shield for the weak and broken. He stood there, trapped, the rage and helplessness churning inside him like a poison. He could not go to the law. He could not leave her there. There was only one path left. He waited until the dead of night, until the moon was hidden behind a bank of clouds, and the ranch was plunged into a profound, breathless darkness. He moved like a shadow, his boots making no sound on the dry earth. He had one of the pry bars from the tool shed. The house was silent, a sleeping beast. He found the old, gnarled oak tree that grew beside the house, its thick branches reaching up like crooked arms toward the attic window. He climbed, the rough bark scraping his hands. He reached the roof, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The attic window was small, latched from the inside. He used the pry bar, the wood groaning in protest before the latch splintered. He slid the window open and slipped inside, into the hot, suffocating darkness. The air was thick with the smell of dust and decay. A faint sliver of moonlight cut through the grime on the window pane, revealing a space filled with old furniture shrouded in white cloths, like a graveyard of forgotten memories. "Clara?" he whispered into the darkness. A faint sound, a weak, broken whimper, came from the far corner. He followed it, stumbling over a broken chair. He found her huddled on the floor, a small, dark shape against the wall. He knelt beside her, and his hand touched her face. She was cold, her skin clammy. She was conscious, but just barely. He could feel the swelling on her cheek, the cut on her lip. He did not need to see the bruises to know they were there. "Eli," she breathed, her voice so faint it was like the rustling of a leaf. "I am here," he said, his own voice choked with a mixture of fury and relief. "I am getting you out." He scooped her into his arms. She was impossibly light, as if her suffering had whittled her away to almost nothing. He carried her to the window, her head lolling against his shoulder. Getting down the tree was harder than getting up, but he managed it, shielding her body with his own. Once on the ground, he did not hesitate. He carried her past the bunkhouse, past the corrals, out into the open desert. The wild, untamed land stretched out before them, vast and dangerous under the star-dusted sky. He did not know exactly where he was going, only that he had to get her away, to hide her, to keep her safe. He remembered talk of an old, abandoned trapper's cabin in the canyons to the north, a place no one had used for years. It was their only chance. He walked all night, his arms aching, his resolve like granite. He carried her out of the darkness of her prison and into the wild, uncertain freedom of the desert night. The canyons to the north were a maze of sun-scorched rock and skeletal junipers, a place the land had folded in on itself to hide its secrets. Eli walked for what felt like an eternity, the dead weight of Clara in his arms a strange and terrible comfort. The desert night was not silent. It was alive with the rustle of unseen things, the high, lonely cry of a coyote, and the whisper of a wind that had traveled over 100 miles of rock and sand. He found the cabin just as the eastern sky was beginning to pale from black to a bruised purple. It was little more than a one-room hovel, built of river stones and rough-hewn logs, tucked under a rock overhang that made it nearly invisible from a distance. The door hung on one leather hinge, and the roof had a hole in it, but it was shelter. It was a place to hide. He laid Clara down on the dusty floor, on a pile of old, dried grasses that was the only soft thing in the room. In the growing light, he could see the full extent of Weatherby's cruelty. Her face was a landscape of pain, her cheeks swollen and discolored, Her lips split and dried with blood. She was burning with fever, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. She was drifting in a twilight world between consciousness and delirium, her body fighting a battle he could not see. For the next 3 days, Eli's world shrank to the size of that small, dusty cabin. He became her nurse, her guardian, her entire world. He fetched water from a hidden seep he found half a mile down the canyon, carrying it back in an old, rust-pitted bucket he'd found in a corner. He tore strips from his remaining clean shirt to bathe her face and bandage her wounds. He ventured out only when necessary, hunting with a skill born of long years on his own, returning with a brace of rabbits that he cooked down into a thin, nourishing broth. He fed it to her a spoonful at a time, coaxing the warm liquid between her cracked lips, whispering to her when she whimpered in her fever dreams. He sat with her through the long, hot days and the cool, star-filled nights. He watched the fever rise and fall, a merciless tide. He talked to her, his voice a low, steady murmur, telling her stories of the places he had been, of the mountains and the sea, of cities with buildings so tall they scraped the clouds. He did not know if she could hear him, but he spoke anyway, filling the silence with his voice, as if he could build a wall of words to keep the darkness at bay. On the 4th morning, he awoke from a light, fitful sleep to find her eyes open. They were clear. The fever had broken. She was looking at him, her gaze lucid and calm. "Eli," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. Relief washed over him so powerfully his knees felt weak. He knelt beside her, offering her a drink of water from a tin cup. She drank greedily, her small hands trembling as she held the cup. "You are safe," he told her, the words feeling like the most important he had ever spoken. "He will not find us here." She looked around the small cabin, at the stone walls and the sliver of blue sky visible through the hole in the roof. She did not look afraid. For the first time since he had met her, the terror was gone from her eyes, replaced by a deep, profound weariness, and something else, a fragile, flickering ember of hope. Her recovery was slow. The bruises on her body faded from angry purple to a sickly yellow-green, and then disappeared altogether. But the wounds inside her were deeper. For days, she was quiet and withdrawn, content to sit in the doorway of the cabin, watching the play of sun and shadow on the canyon walls. But Eli was patient. He did not push her. He gave her the gift of his quiet presence, a steadfast anchor in the stillness of her new life. And slowly she began to heal. The vast, wild landscape that had been her prison became her classroom. He taught her how to survive in it, how to read its signs and understand its rhythms. He fashioned a small fishing line from a piece of string and a bent nail, and taught her how to catch the small, silvery fish that lived in the deeper pools of the creek. He showed her how to find north by the stars, how to tell which plants were safe to eat, and how to track a deer by the faintest of marks in the soil. He also taught her to ride. His buckskin was a gentle, patient horse, and Eli led him around in a small circle at first, with Clara perched nervously on the saddle, her hands clutching the pommel. But soon, her fear gave way to a tentative confidence. He taught her how to hold the reins, how to use the pressure of her knees to guide the animal, how to feel the rhythm of its gait and move with it. One afternoon, she urged the horse into a slow canter, her hair flying behind her, and a small, breathless smile touched her lips. She was no longer a prisoner, a secret hidden in the shadows. She was a girl on a horse, with the wind in her hair and the wide, open sky above her. Their days were filled with these small, quiet lessons, and their nights were spent by a small, smokeless fire just inside the cabin's overhang. The western landscape was their only companion. They watched dust storms gather on the horizon, great, roiling clouds of red earth that turned the sky to fire. They listened to the howl of wolves in the distant hills, a sound that was not frightening, but wild and mournful and free. And they looked up at the stars, a brilliant, spangled canopy of light, More stars than Clara had ever imagined, burning with a cold, clean fire in the vast, open darkness of the desert sky. As her body healed, her spirit began to mend as well. The quiet, frightened girl from the stable began to disappear, replaced by someone new. She started to smile more. Small, shy smiles at first, but they grew more frequent, more confident. She began to tease him, her eyes sparkling with a gentle mischief he had never seen before. She would make fun of his crude attempts to mend his shirt, or the way he hummed off-key as he worked. And he would tease her back about the smudge of dirt on her nose or her own clumsy first attempts at starting a fire. Their affection for each other, which had been born in secret and desperation, now had room to breathe, to grow in the clean desert air. It was a thing of simple, quiet gestures. He would tuck a wildflower he had found into her hair. She would save him the best piece of fish from their meager meals. Their hands would brush as they worked side by side, and the touch would linger, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that was growing between them, a bond that felt as solid and real as the rock of the canyon walls. Their affection grew physical, but it was always tender, always respectful, born of a deep and abiding care for the wounded soul of the other. One night, they sat outside the cabin, leaning against the warm stone wall, watching the moon rise over the rim of the canyon. The air was cool and smelled of dust and sagebrush. They had been silent for a long time, comfortable in the shared quiet. Then, Clara turned to him, her face serious in the pale moonlight. "Eli?" she began, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you want me, after everything I have been through?" The question was raw, vulnerable, filled with all the years of being told she was cursed, spoiled, and unlovable. She was asking him if her past, the ugliness that had been forced upon her, had made her unworthy of affection, of desire. She was asking him if she was broken beyond repair. Eli looked at her beautiful, haunted face, at the strength he had seen grow in her day by day, at the resilient spirit that had refused to be extinguished. He knew that any words he could offer would be clumsy and inadequate, a pale shadow of the truth he felt in his heart. So he did not answer with words. He reached out, his hand gentle on her arm, and drew her to her feet. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. It was not a passionate embrace. Not at first. It was an embrace of reassurance, of safety, of profound and absolute acceptance. He held her as he had held her that night in the stable, a silent, solid presence against the darkness. He felt her take a deep, shuddering breath, and then she relaxed against him, her arms circling his waist, holding on as if he were the only solid thing in a spinning world. He lowered his head, burying his face in her soft, fragrant hair, and just held her under the vast, silent, star-dusted sky. Their love, in that moment, became what it had always been, a quiet act of rebellion against the cruelty of the world. Their fragile peace was destined to be broken. They were running low on supplies, salt, coffee, and medicine for Clara's still healing wounds. Eli knew he had to risk a trip to a town, but not to redemption. He rode west for a full day, to a smaller, more isolated settlement where no one would know his face. He sold the last of his few valuables, a silver pocket watch his father had given him, for a handful of coins. As he was leaving the general store, his saddlebags filled with meager supplies, he saw it. Nailed to a post outside the marshal's office was a piece of paper. It was a wanted poster, but it was not for a bank robber or a cattle rustler. It was for him. A crude drawing of his face was sketched at the top, and below it, the words burned into his brain. $100 reward for the capture of Eli Carson. Wanted for the kidnapping of Clara Belle Weatherby. The poster was signed by Marshal Davis of Redemption and authorized by Thaddeus Weatherby. A cold dread washed over him. Weatherby had twisted the truth, painting Eli as a villain and himself as the grieving, worried father. He had used his power, his influence, and his money to turn the law into his own personal weapon. The posters said Clara was a troubled and simple-minded girl, easily influenced, and that she had been taken against her will by a dangerous drifter. He had turned the entire territory into a hunting party. Every man with a horse and a gun would be looking for them now, not to rescue a girl, but to claim a bounty. He rode back to the cabin with a heavy heart, the news a cold stone in his gut. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the sky a dark, bruised purple. It was a perfect mirror for the storm that was about to break over their lives. He found Clara by the creek, and she knew the moment she saw his face that something was terribly wrong. He told her everything, his voice low and grim. He told her about the bounty, about the lies, about the men who were probably already combing the canyons for them. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "We have to ride north. Keep moving. We can lose them in the mountains." He expected her to be afraid. He expected her to agree without question, but she just stood there, her expression unreadable. She looked at the creek, at the canyon walls, at the darkening sky. She looked at the world she had just begun to discover. When she finally looked back at him, her eyes were clear and steady. There was no fear in them. There was only a quiet, unshakable resolve. "No," she said. Eli stared at her, confused. "No, Clara, they will find us. They will hang me and drag you back to him." "I know," she said, her voice soft but firm. "He kept me in a cage made of silence and fear my whole life. Eli, running is just a bigger cage. If we run forever, I will still be his prisoner. I will still be afraid." She stepped closer to him, taking his hands in hers. "I am not the girl you found crying in the stable anymore. You taught me how to ride. You taught me how to be strong. Now I have to use it." Eli's heart was torn in two. He was terrified of losing her, of seeing her dragged back into that nightmare. His every instinct screamed at him to protect her, to hide her away from the world that wanted to hurt her. But he looked into her eyes and he saw that she was no longer a victim to be protected. She was a woman making a choice. To deny her that would be to treat her as Weatherby had, to make her a prisoner of his own fear. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "I want to go back," she said, her grip on his hands tightening. "I want to go back and tell them the truth. I want to look them in the eyes and tell them what he did. I want to reclaim my voice." A fierce light burned in her eyes, the light of a fire that had been banked for too long. "If we run forever," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that stunned him, "I will still be afraid. I want to be free, even if it kills me." They rode back to redemption as the storm they had watched from the canyons finally broke. It was not a cleansing rain, not yet. It was a prelude, a restless and violent morning where the sky was the color of a fresh bruise and the wind tore at them with angry, dust-choked gusts. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and wet creosote, an atmosphere of tense, pregnant waiting. They did not huddle against the wind. They rode with their heads held high, their shoulders squared against the gale. Their hands, clasped together over the saddle horn, were a single, defiant fist. Eli's knuckles were white, his grip a promise. Clara's fingers were intertwined with his, her touch a declaration. They were no longer running. They were returning. As they entered the single, dusty street of the town, it felt as though every window had become an eye. Faces appeared in doorways, then vanished. The usual morning bustle of the blacksmith's hammer and the chatter from the general store was gone, replaced by an unnerving, watchful silence. The townsfolk had seen the wanted posters. They had heard Weatherby's story. In their eyes, Eli was a kidnapper, and Clara was the mad, lost girl he had stolen. Their intertwined hands were not a sign of love, but of criminality and corruption. Eli reined his horse to a stop, not in front of the saloon or the marshal's office, but before the town's small, whitewashed church. A cross, stark and simple, reached for the bruised sky. If there was any justice to be found in this town, he reasoned, its roots ought to be here, in the house of God. He helped Clara dismount, and they walked up the 3 wooden steps, his hand resting on the small of her back, a steady, reassuring pressure. The preacher, a man named Reverend Miller, was sweeping the porch, his movements fussy and precise. He was a thin, pale man with watery blue eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently pursed in mild disapproval. He looked up as they approached, and a flicker of fear, quickly masked by pious severity, crossed his face. "Reverend," Eli began, his voice low and steady, "we have come to you for help. A great wrong has been done to this woman. We are seeking justice." The preacher stopped sweeping. He looked at Clara, his gaze lingering for a moment on her simple, travel-stained dress and the determined set of her jaw. He saw not a victim seeking sanctuary, but a problem, a disruption to the careful order of his flock. He turned his gaze back to Eli, his eyes as cold and hard as river stones. "I have seen the poster, Mr. Carson," the preacher said, his voice clipped and devoid of compassion. "The law is looking for you. This is a matter for the marshal, not for the church. I suggest you turn yourself in and return that poor, troubled girl to her guardian." "He is not her guardian. He is her tormentor," Eli said, his voice tight with a frustration he was struggling to contain. "She is not troubled. She is terrified. Will you not listen to her story?" "I listen to the word of God," Reverend Miller said, his face a mask of self-righteousness. "And I do not meddle in the private family affairs of the good people of this town. Mr. Weatherby is a benefactor of this church. Now, I must ask you to leave. You are trespassing on holy ground." He turned his back on them, a final, damning gesture, and resumed sweeping the porch, his whisking broom the only sound in the charged silence. He swept away the dust, and with it, any claim he had to being a man of God. Eli's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He put his arm around Clara's shoulders and led her away. There was no sanctuary here. Their next stop was the marshal's office, the law. Marshal Davis was a large, heavy-set man, his belly straining the buttons of his shirt. He sat with his dusty boots propped up on his desk, cleaning his fingernails with the tip of a knife. He did not get up when they entered. He simply watched them from under the brim of his hat, his eyes shrewd and lazy, like a coyote's. "Well, well," the marshal drawled, a smirk playing on his lips. "Saves my men the trouble of hunting you down. Carson, you here to collect your own bounty?" "I am here to report a crime," Eli said, his voice hard. "Thaddeus Weatherby has kept his stepdaughter a prisoner for years. He has beaten her and starved her. The things written on that poster are lies." The marshal sighed, a long, theatrical sound of boredom. He swung his boots off the desk and leaned forward, the smirk gone, his expression now one of dangerous impatience. "Listen to me, drifter. I do not know what kind of game you are playing, and I do not much care. What I do know is that Thaddeus Weatherby is a landowner. He pays his taxes. He causes me no trouble. You, on the other hand, you are trouble. You show up, and suddenly the whole town is in an uproar. I have got a warrant for your arrest. For kidnapping." "It was not kidnapping. It was a rescue," Eli insisted. "Ask her. Let her speak." The marshal glanced at Clara, his eyes dismissive. "Everyone in this town knows that girl ain't right. Weatherby has had a hard time with her since her mother passed. Now, you have 2 choices. You can hand the girl over, and I will let you ride out of this territory and never come back. Or, you can make a fuss, and I will lock you in that cell and throw away the key. Either way, the girl goes back to her stepfather. It is his legal right." The finality in the marshal's voice was like a slammed door. The law, like the church, was a fortress built to protect the powerful, and its gates were closed to them. They were utterly alone. Eli looked at Clara. He saw the flicker of despair in her eyes, the tremor in her hands. He had brought her here to find justice, and instead, he had led her into a cage with no exit. He was ready to fight, to take the marshal's second option and go down swinging. But Clara, the girl who had spent a lifetime in silence, found her voice. "No," she said, the word quiet but ringing with a surprising strength. She looked not at the marshal, but at Eli. "There is another place." She turned and walked out of the office. Eli followed, confused but trusting her. She did not walk toward the edge of town. She walked directly across the street, toward the one place he never would have taken her. The one place a woman of her standing was never supposed to enter, the swinging doors of the Redemption Saloon. She pushed them open and stepped inside. The saloon fell silent. It was midday, and the room was filled with a dozen men, ranch hands, prospectors, a few sullen-looking men Eli recognized as Weatherby's cronies. They were drinking, playing cards, their world a haze of smoke and cheap whiskey. Every single one of them turned to stare at the woman who had dared to cross their threshold. Their faces held a mixture of shock, curiosity, and contempt. Eli stepped in behind her, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. He was a shield, a silent warning. He stood by the door as Clara walked slowly, deliberately, into the center of the room. She stood there, a small, solitary figure in a sea of hostile faces, the years of abuse and fear visible in the slight tremble of her hands. But her chin was held high. She took a deep breath, and she began to speak. "My name is Clara Bell," she said, her voice shaking at first, but growing stronger with every word. "Most of you know me only as a story. The strange girl, the touched girl, the one kept hidden for her own good." A few men snickered. One of Weatherby's men called out, "Your PA is worried sick about you, girl. This drifter filling your head with nonsense?" Clara did not look at him. She looked from one face to the next, her gaze unflinching. "He is not my father," she said, her voice clear and carrying to every corner of the room. "He is my stepfather, and he told you I was not right in the head. He was lying." The room was utterly silent now. The men's interest peaked. This was better than any card game. "For 5 years, since my mother died, he has kept me a prisoner. He told you he was protecting me. He was hiding me. He shuttered my windows. He burned my mother's books. He told me that I was cursed, that the world was a wicked place, and that he was the only one who could keep me safe. But the only wickedness I have ever known has been inside the walls of that house. The only danger I have ever faced has been his hand and his silence." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the stunned faces. "He beat me when I cried for my mother. He locked me in the dark when I asked to go outside. He told me I was worthless so many times that I began to believe him. The man who came here today," she said, her voice softening as she glanced back at Eli, "is the first person in 5 years who has shown me any kindness. He did not kidnap me. He saved me." The men shifted uncomfortably. They looked at each other, then at the floor. Her words were simple, but they had the undeniable ring of truth. The story they had all accepted, the easy, comfortable rumor, was being methodically torn apart before their eyes. At first, a wave of scoffing and disbelief rippled through the crowd. It was too much to take in, too big a lie to have been living with. "It is a trick," one man muttered. "The drifter put her up to it." But then, from a table in the back, an old woman stood up. She was Martha, the wife of the blacksmith, a woman with eyes that had seen 70 years of life and sorrow in this hard land. She had been in the saloon delivering her husband's lunch, and had stayed, forgotten in the corner, to listen. "She is telling the truth," Martha said, her voice raspy but strong. The whole room turned to look at her. "I remember her mother, Eleanor. A finer woman never lived. And I remember this girl, playing in the garden. She was not strange. She was bright as a new penny. Then, after Eleanor died, she was just gone. We all saw it. We all looked away. I always knew something was wrong." Her words hung in the air. A stone of truth dropped into a well of lies. A few other women, who had gathered at the doors, drawn by the commotion, nodded in agreement. A seed of doubt had been planted, and it was beginning to take root. It was at that moment that the saloon doors burst open with such violence that they slammed against the interior walls. Thaddeus Weatherby stood there, his face a mask of incandescent fury. His clothes were disheveled, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He had been drinking, and he was holding a Colt revolver in his hand, its barrel shaking with his rage. "There you are," he snarled, his eyes locking on Clara. "Spouting your poison. I will teach you to lie about me." He raised the gun, but Eli was already moving. He launched himself at Weatherby, not to disarm him, but to drive him away from Clara, to put his own body between them. The two men crashed into a table, sending cards and glasses flying. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, splintering the wood of the ceiling. What followed was not a duel. It was a brutal, desperate fight for life. Weatherby was bigger, heavier, fueled by whiskey and a lifetime of rage. Eli was quicker, stronger, fueled by a righteous fury that burned hotter than any liquor. They rolled on the floor, their fists finding purchase, the sounds of their grunts and the sickening thud of their blows echoing through the silent room. Weatherby brought his knee up hard into Eli's side, and Eli gasped, the pain a white-hot flash. A bottle swept off a nearby table caught Eli on the side of the head, and for a moment, the world went gray, the room spinning. Weatherby scrambled on top of him, his thumbs finding Eli's throat, his face a grotesque mask of hatred. "I will kill you for touching what is mine," he hissed. Eli, his vision blurring, his lungs screaming for air, saw Clara's terrified face over Weatherby's shoulder. That image, the fear in her eyes, the fear he had sworn to banish forever, gave him a last, desperate surge of strength. He bucked hard, throwing Weatherby off balance, and drove his fist into the man's jaw with all the force he had left. Weatherby's head snapped back, and he collapsed onto the floor, stunned and groaning. The saloon was in chaos, but the gun lay on the floorboards, halfway between Eli and Weatherby. Clara, moving as if in a dream, stepped forward and picked it up. The room fell silent again. Every eye was on her. She held the heavy revolver in her two hands, the barrel shaking. She pointed it at the man on the floor, the man who had stolen her childhood, the man who had broken her spirit. He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a flicker of fear, the first fear she had ever seen in him. She had the power. In her hands, she held the ultimate justice, the final silence. Eli, staggering to his feet, blood trickling from the gash on his temple, saw the look on her face and his heart stopped. But she did not pull the trigger. She looked down at her tormentor, at his pathetic, groveling form, and she saw him for what he was, a small, cruel, frightened man. And she knew that to kill him would be to let him win, to let his violence become her own. "I do not need to be like you," she said, her voice quiet but clear, a final verdict. She lowered the gun and let it fall from her hands. It clattered onto the floor, loud in the stillness. That was the moment the spell of fear was broken. The townsfolk, who had stood by as silent spectators, finally moved. The blacksmith, a mountain of a man, lunged forward and grabbed Weatherby, hauling him to his feet. Two other men joined him, pinning Weatherby's arms behind his back. Marshal Davis, seeing the tide of public opinion turn so violently, pushed his way through the crowd, his face grim. He knew he had no choice now. He pulled out a pair of iron cuffs and locked them around Weatherby's wrists. The law had finally been forced to do its duty. The ordeal was over. The tension that had held Clara upright, the adrenaline that had fueled her courage, suddenly drained away. Her face went pale, her eyes rolled back in her head, and she collapsed. Eli, wounded and exhausted, caught her before she hit the floor. He lifted her into his arms, her head resting on his shoulder. At that exact moment, the storm outside finally broke its promise. A low rumble of thunder shook the building. and a steady, heavy rain began to fall. He carried her out of the saloon, through the swinging doors, and into the street. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the dust to mud, washing the grit from the air, washing the blood from the cut on his head. The townsfolk followed, their faces a mixture of shame and awe, watching as this wounded man carried this brave woman through the muddy street. Their future was a blank, uncertain page, but the rain was washing the old world away, and for the first time, the future was theirs to write. The wheels of justice, once they were finally forced to turn, ground slowly but exceeding fine. Thaddeus Weatherby, stripped of his land and his reputation, was sentenced by a traveling judge to a long term in the territorial prison. The ranch, heavily mortgaged and mismanaged for years, was sold off to pay his debts. The bunkhouse emptied, the horses were auctioned, and a silence fell over the place. A silence not of peace, but of emptiness. Eli and Clara did not stay to watch. The day Weatherby was taken away in chains was the last day they set foot on that cursed land. They did not go far. With the small amount of money Eli had saved, and a portion of the bounty that a shame-faced Marshal Davis had insisted he take, they filed a claim on a modest 100-acre plot of land 5 miles north of town. It was a piece of the wild country, untouched by the plow, a place of rolling hills, stubborn rock, and a creek that ran strong in the spring but slowed to a trickle by the heart of summer. The land was not easy. It was wild, but it was beautiful, and most importantly, it was theirs. Months passed. The raw, open wound of their ordeal began to scar over. They lived at first in a simple canvas tent, their lives stripped down to the bare essentials: work, food, and sleep. They rose with the sun and worked until their muscles ached and their hands were raw. Together, they cleared a small patch of land for a garden. Together, they dug the foundations for a home. Eli, with a patient, methodical skill Clara had not known he possessed, began to build. He felled cottonwood trees by the creek, squared them into logs with an adze and a broadaxe, and slowly, painstakingly, raised the walls of a small, 2-room cabin. It was not the grand house Clara had grown up in, but every log was a testament to their shared future. Every nail-driven home a defiance of their past. The land tested them. A late frost killed their first planting of corn. Coyotes, their yips and howls a nightly chorus on the hills, stole 2 of their 3 chickens. The summer sun was a relentless hammer, and the creek, as predicted, dwindled until they had to dig for water in its sandy bed. But they did not falter. The hardship was honest. It was the straightforward struggle of life against the elements. A clean and simple battle compared to the twisted, silent war they had survived. This land, in its harshness, was fair. It demanded everything they had, but it did not lie. It did not whisper poison in the dark. While Eli built the walls of their home, Clara built a life within them. She planted a new garden, this time with hardier crops, squash, beans, potatoes, that could withstand the punishing sun. She learned the rhythms of the seasons, the language of the birds, the habits of the jackrabbits and the deer, and along the rough split-rail fence that Eli had built to mark the edge of their property, she planted wildflowers. She gathered the seeds from the surrounding hills, Indian paintbrush, purple lupine, and cheerful yellow daisies. It was a small, seemingly frivolous act in a life that was all about survival, but to her, it was essential. She was not just surviving. She was living. She was planting beauty in a world that had shown her so much ugliness. Eli watched her, and the quiet, steady man who had ridden into redemption looking for nothing but work and quiet found himself changing. The deep lines of caution around his eyes began to soften. He still bore the scars of his fight with Weatherby, a thin, white line on his temple where the bottle had cut him, a slight ache in his ribs on cold mornings, but these were just marks on his skin. Inside, a quiet joy was taking root. He found himself smiling more. Small, easy smiles that came without thought. He would watch Clara as she knelt in the dirt, tending her flowers, her face smudged with soil, and a feeling of such profound contentment would wash over him that it almost hurt. One afternoon, using the leftover lumber from the cabin, he built her a porch swing. He worked on it in secret. In the evenings after she had gone to bed, he sanded the wood until it was smooth as silk and fashioned the joints with a craftsman's care. When it was finished, he hung it from the rafters of the small porch he had just completed. He called her outside, and her gasp of surprise was all the thanks he needed. She sat on it, pushing off gently with her toes, a slow, creaking rhythm that quickly became the sound of their evenings. They would sit there together as the sun went down, the sky turning from orange to violet, their shoulders touching, not needing to speak. The healing was not a straight line. There were nights when Clara would wake with a cry, her body rigid, her eyes wide with a terror that came from a place he could not reach. She was back in the attic, in the dark, and the memories were not memories at all, but a living, breathing thing. On those nights, Eli would not speak. He would simply hold her, his arms a firm, steady anchor in the storm of her fear. He would hold her until the shaking subsided, until her breathing evened out, until she was back with him, in the quiet of their small cabin, safe. And with each passing week, the nightmares came less frequently. The past was losing its power. The town of redemption, which had first scorned them and then, grudgingly, vindicated them, began to see them in a new light. Shame is a powerful motivator, and the townsfolk, faced with the undeniable truth of Weatherby's cruelty, felt a collective guilt for their blindness. They began to make small overtures of peace. The blacksmith offered Eli the use of his forge. His wife, Martha, brought them a laying hen to replace the ones the coyotes had taken, and a jar of her best preserves. Slowly, people began to seek Clara out. They learned that the quiet girl who lived in the hills had a gentle way with animals, a knowledge of herbs and wild plants passed down from her mother. When a farmer's best cow was having a difficult birth, he rode out to their cabin in desperation. Clara, with a calm competence that surprised both the farmer and Eli, helped deliver the calf. When a child from the town wandered off into the hills and became lost, it was Clara who knew the hidden ravines and gullies, who understood the land well enough to guess where a frightened boy might go to hide. She found him, cold and scared but unharmed, huddled in a small cave by the creek bed. She was no longer the cursed girl or the strange girl. The whispers and rumors had been replaced by a new title, one spoken with a quiet respect. She was Clara, who survived. She had faced down the worst their community had to offer, and she had not only endured, she had emerged with a strength and grace that shamed them all. She accepted their help and their respect with a quiet dignity, never speaking of the past, never holding their blindness against them. She had found her freedom not in forgetting, but in forging a new life so full and real that the shadows of the old one had no place to hide. One night, late in the fall, after the first hard frost had silvered the land, Eli stood on the porch, looking up at the sky. The harvest was in. The small cabin was snug and warm, and a feeling of deep peace settled over him. The stars were a brilliant, scattered dust of diamonds against a bolt of black velvet. He thought of all the nights he had spent under those same stars. A lonely, drifting man with no anchor and no home. He had been looking for quiet, and he had found it. But it was not the empty quiet of solitude. It was the rich, full quiet of a shared life. He heard the cabin door open behind him, and a moment later, Clara was beside him. She wrapped a heavy wool quilt, one she had made herself, around his shoulders, then slipped in under it beside him, her warmth a comfort against the cold night air. She followed his gaze up to the heavens. They stood in silence for a long time, watching the stars, their breaths misting in the air. The only sounds were the rustle of the dry cornstalks in the field and the distant, lonely call of an owl. Thank you, she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost a part of the wind. She leaned her head against his shoulder. For not leaving that night. The words took him back in an instant, to the dusty, storm-racked stable, to the sight of her, small and terrified in the hay. He remembered the vow he had made to himself, to stay until sunrise. He looked down at her, at the way the starlight caught in her hair, at the peaceful, trusting expression on her face, and he felt a love so vast and deep, it seemed to fill the entire night sky. He pulled the quilt tighter around them and answered, his voice a low, rough murmur against her hair. I still have not, the wind whispered through the dry fields, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. They sat down on the porch swing, the gentle, creaking rhythm a soft counterpoint to the vast silence of the night. Their bodies touched, a simple, profound connection of warmth and presence. The future stretched out before them, an unknown territory. It would not be easy. There would be more droughts, more frosts, more hardships. It would not be perfect. The scars of their past would always be a part of them, but it would be real, and it would be theirs. It was a love that had been carved out of silence, born of sorrow, and proven by the light of a single sunrise. A love that had found its first, fragile hope in a stable, and would now endure, strong and true, under the wide and watchful eyes of the western stars. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from to connect with others. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel, and share your thoughts in English.